Hello everyone and welcome to this Bookmarks event. Today we are talking about the Paris Commune, that incredible example from 150 years ago of workers running things for themselves for an all too brief period of time. In particular, we're talking tonight about William Morris's poem about the Commune, The Pilgrims of Hope, which has been republished with a new intro by Redwords Books. We have two speakers this evening. We are very pleased to have Michael Rosen with us today. He's asked to be described as that bloke who was dead and is now back with us. People may have been following his experience, will have heard of his experience with COVID over the past year. He's also, of course, an author, a poet, and former children's laureate. So very pleased to welcome Michael. And we have Paul O'Brien, a comrade from People Before Profit in Ireland. Paul is the author of Shelley in Revolutionary Ireland. He wrote the intro to Redwords' book, Shelley's Revolutionary Year. And he's also just finished writing a political biography of Sean O'Casey. So after the speakers have both said a bit, we'll have time for questions for the speakers. So if you're watching this live, then you can put your questions in the chat on Facebook, and we'll send them to the speakers. So we'll kick things off by hearing from Paul.
Thank you. First, let me say I'm delighted to be associated with this event, really for two reasons. This is the 150th anniversary of the Paris Commune of 1871, which Marx described as the prototype for a revolutionary government of the future, a state run by workers in the interests of workers. And the second reason is that it's a celebration of William Morris, whose work in the arts and crafts movement is still appreciated, but his prose and poetry, it seems to be not very fashionable today. Now, poetry and song have always been part of the radical and socialist tradition. We only have to go back to the 70s and 80s and Rock Against Racism and how that was used politically. And even further back to 1892, when Bernard Shaw describes going to a meeting in the East End of London and listening to working men reciting verses from Shelley's Queen Mab as part of their contribution to the meeting. Also, Harold Lasky, he describes visiting the Northumberland miners during the great slump of the 1930s, where he found copies of William Morris's A Dream of John Ball and News from Nowhere in house after house in the area that he visited, even though most of the furniture had been sold or removed. Those books were precious to the miners of Northumberland and the northeast of England. And what I'm so glad is that Redwords are continuing in that tradition, publishing the works of William Morris, of Percy Bysshe Shelley, of Alexander Pushkin's great poem, The Bronze Horseman. And I think why they've continued in it, because they understand, as Morris understood, that literature is part of an intellectual movement to imagine a different sort of world. When William Morris launched Commonweal in 1885, which was the paper of the Socialist League, he was determined that poetry would be a regular feature of the paper, because he understood that it's not enough to explain or theorize about the world that we live in. We have to inspire people to an understanding that another world is possible. And this was the message in our own time that Paul Foot argued for over and over again. How do we use words as weapons? The great prose and poetry of the past is a powerful weapon for us to get our message across. Now, if we look at the Pilgrims of Hope, it was first published in serial form. Now, this wasn't uncommon. Nearly all the novels of Dickens was published in serial form before it arrived in book form. But the first verse of it, The Message of the March Wind, appeared in one of the early editions of Commonweal in 1885. And it continued over the next 12 issues of the paper until mid 1886. And the story at one level is actually very simple enough. The lovers, Richard and his wife, who are the Pilgrims of Hope, and whose story we follow right through the poem, as they hear on the wind. And here you see echoes of Shelley's Ode to the West Wind in this poem. They hear on the wind about the issues facing the world. Here's what they say. Hark, this is in verse 1, the message of the March wind. Hark, the wind in the elm boughs, from London it bloweth, and telling of gold and of hope and unrest. And as they hear the news of the unrest across the country, they are faced with a choice. Do they stay in their country village and enjoy a peaceful life? Or do they go forth and join those people who are fighting for a better world and try to change it? And we follow their pilgrimage right through the poem, the pilgrimage of hope, first to London with its poverty and commercialization, the degradation that industrialization had brought to the people. And secondly, then their encounter with the radical and communist movement in London. And then their journey to Paris to support the communards, the revolution that had broken out, as I said, in 1871. And finally, their return to London after the defeat of the Commune. Now, no doubt, if you read this poem, and I really think you should, I think it's a wonderful piece. This is a difficult and complex poem. It's 37 pages long. And it wanders down many byways in terms of the complex emotional relationships of the main characters and the political issues that were current when Morris wrote the poem. Sometime around when he wrote it, Morris was reading Karl Marx's Capital. And he describes that, he says that I had no problem with the historical background in Marx's work, but I found the economics very hard going and very difficult. And he went on to say, I found Marx's work almost as difficult as a poem by Robert Browning. Now, The Pilgrims of Hope is much more accessible than Browning or Volume 3 of Capital. But I think the reader has to do a little bit of work to get the most out of the poem. And I suggest you start with the introduction by Mike Rosen. I think it's a wonderful introduction to the poem. And then move on to the two essays at the end of the poem by William Morris and Frederick Engels, who write on the Paris Commune, why we celebrate the Paris Commune. And then the final essay by Nicholas Salmon, which gives you the history of the poem, the production of the poem, and the background, the historical background in which William Morris and the events that he wrote the poem. And I found that essay very useful. All of the essays very useful. And then going back to read the poem, I got so much more out of it by doing that. But one of the things that interested me and struck me when I was reading the poem was how the issues that concerned William Morris and the Socialist League in 1885 still have currency today and are reflected in this poem. There is an anti-war current within it. He talks about the imperialist adventure by the British Army into Egypt and the Sudan in 1885, 1886. This is verse 3, Sending to the War, where he deals with this issue. I was down in our far-off village that we heard of the war begun, but none of the neighbours were in it, save the squire's thick-lipped son, a youth and a fool and a captain, who came and went away, and left me glad of his going. There was little for us to say. And the other issue, which strikes you immediately when you read the poem, is the anti-demonstration bill by the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, that is going through Parliament or has just gone through Parliament today, and the protests that are taking place across Great Britain against it. If you go back, this is a carbon copy of how the police behaved in 1885, using the obstruction laws to ban radical and socialist meetings, outdoor meetings, the issue that Morris takes up in the Pilgrims of Progress. Morris and the Socialist League opposed on the streets this new the way the obstruction law was being used by the police to stop socialists and radicals getting their message across. And many of their members went to jail as a result of it. And this is a theme that runs right through verses 5, 6, and 7 of the poem. And Richard, one of the pilgrims, who's now in London and joined the radical movement, is imprisoned for speaking at an open-air public meeting in the course of the poem. And while not a central issue in this poem, I think his work as a whole speaks to our generation about the issue of climate change, climate degradation. His emphasis right through his work on cooperation rather than consumption, I think is a very radical message for today. And his famous quote, have nothing in your house that you do not know to be useful or believe to be beautiful, actually speaks to us today in a way, you know, that's so simple and to the point. When Karl Liebknecht, and I'll try and come to some sort of conclusion around these sort of ideas. When Karl Liebknecht was writing about the failed German Revolution of 1819, he said that there are defeats that feel like victories. And William Morris understood that, because in his essay in the book, Why We Celebrate the Commune of Paris, he writes how some very good socialist comrades had argued with him that it was a mistake to celebrate a defeat. Why would you celebrate the defeat of the Commune? What have we got to learn from that? And Morris, just like Karl Liebknecht, understood that out of defeats can come victories if we learn the lessons of why we lost those particular battles. And Morris went on to say, true, they failed in conquering immediate material freedom for the people, but they quickened and strengthened the ideas of freedom by their courageous action and made our hope of today possible. And if today anyone doubts that they were fighting for the emancipation of labor, their enemies at the time had no doubt about the matter. And if you look at this poem and Morris's work as a whole, I think what's important is that what Morris had done in the 1880s is reconfigure the fault lines between literature and politics. He wrote to make the past part of the present, to learn the lessons of the past and to put them over in an imaginative and inspiring way that people can sort of take it into their mind. And for me, The Pilgrims of Hope is a work that can be read both as a literary work and as propaganda for a world that has yet to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for that great introduction and for bringing out some of the ways in which the themes of this book still resonate with us today. I'm going to bring in our next speaker, other speaker, Michael Rosen. But while he's speaking, if you have questions or if there are things you want our speakers to talk more about or explain a bit more, then now's your chance to use the Facebook chat and ask your questions and make your comments. But yeah, well, pass over to former children's laureate, author and poet Michael Rosen. Seem to be having a slight technical difficulty. Is Michael still here?
One, two, 1, 2. 1, 2, 1, 2.
I think you're back.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, I fear that I may be coming and going. We're at the disposal at
Gone.
Yeah, so I think it's very, very unstable, this signal. I'm very sorry about this. It's not Bookmarks' fault. It is the delights of BT. So Camilla is shaking her head. I can hear myself, but
I can hear you now.
Yeah. Well, if maybe I'll just talk for a minute or two if I'm coming and going, just give you an idea of how the book is laid out if Paul disappeared. So the way we've done the book, this is Roger Huddle and me. The book is laid out with an intro from me, and then you get the poem, and then you get an essay from the critic Nicholas Salmon, who sets the poem in its historical context with some very interesting biographical material that relates closely to the politics of the time when Morris wrote the poem. And then there's Morris's own essay, Why We Celebrate the Paris Commune, that he wrote in 1887 after he had written Pilgrims of Hope. Then we get Friedrich Engel's introduction and afterword to a later edition of Marx's essay on the Commune. So we get that. And then we have a timeline for the Civil War. Now, I don't know whether you're still hearing me. Give me a thumbs up if you can. Camilla, if you can hear me. Yes, good. I'll need to do that. So I was just going to read you a little bit. So my own comment in the introduction about the poem is that it's unique. We can't find its equivalent in the 19th century. It's a work that expresses the diversity of experience involved in trying to get through life, taking on board needs, desires, hopes, and actions in the political contexts or equivalent contemporary ones which Morris participated. So we're getting an idea that the poem, exactly as Paul in the part that I heard Paul talking about, is it's both personal, social, and political. And you can hear in the lines of Morris's struggle, if you like, with how we as activists try to integrate and cope with the stresses in our personal lives with the political ones, and it interrelates, and to that extent I think is fascinating and unique. So if I may read you a little bit from what Morris actually said about why we celebrate the Commune. He said it's our duty. It was when he was addressing people about it, came from a speech and first published in Commonweal, which he edited, our duty to raise the whole story out of the poisonous gloom and bring it to the light of day. So as we know, history is not only just about telling, it's also about the struggle to get things told. And Morris is referring to that. And he went on to say, I've heard it said, and by good socialists too, that it's a mistake to commemorate a defeat. But it seems to me that this means looking not at this event only, but at all history in too narrow a way. The commune of history is but one link in the struggle which has gone on through all history of the oppressed against the oppressors, and without all the defeats of past times, we should now have no hope of the final victory. So I know that us people on the left, we struggle with defeats and victories. When we have victories, obviously we're triumphant and we're very pleased about it, but defeats, what meaning do we make out of defeat? And of course, it's quite true. The Commune suffered a terrible defeat, and there was a massacre. There was, as presumably Paul mentioned, but a terrible massacre. And if ever you want to pay your dues, if you like, to that massacre, go to the Père Lachaise cemetery in Paris, and there you can see the site, the wall at which they shot them. And again, Morris says, true, they failed in conquering immediate material freedom for the people, but they quickened and strengthened the ideas of freedom by courageous action and made our hope of today possible. And if today anyone doubts that they were fighting for the emancipation of labor, their enemies at the time had no doubt about the matter. They saw in them no mere political opponents, but, quote, enemies of society, unquote, people who could not live in the same world with them because the basis of their ideas of life was different. To wit, humanity, not property. That was why the fall of the Commune was celebrated by such hecatombs sacrificed to the bourgeois god Mammon, by such a riot of blood and cruelty on the part of the conquerors as quite literally has no parallel in modern times. And it's by that same token that we honour them as the foundation stone of the new world that is to be. And so we can hear that what Morris is trying to say there. And if I just read you a little bit from Engels, also in this book. So he tells us when the commune comes about, and then he goes through the achievements of the commune. He reminds us. I mean, it is always worth reminding ourselves exactly in that tiny space of time, this group of workers, the despised and representatives, despised by France, ignored, and then, of course, massacred. So look what they put through. They said that any employee of the commune their income might not exceed 6,000 francs, so they introduced equal pay and capped it. On the following day, the commune decreed the separation of the church from the state, the abolition of all state payments for religious purposes, as well as the transformation of all church property into national property. April the 8th, a decree excluding from the schools all religious symbols, pictures, dogmas, prayers. Got to remember the incredible power of the Catholic Church at this time. In the word, all that belongs to the sphere of the individual's conscience was ordered to be excluded from the schools, and this decree was gradually applied. On the 5th, in reply to the shooting day after day of the commune's fighters captured by the Versailles troops, a decree was issued for imprisonment of hostages, never carried into effect. The guillotine was brought out by the 137th Battalion of the National Guard and publicly burnt amid great decided that the victory column at the Place Vendôme, which had been cast from guns captured by Napoleon after the War of 1809, should be demolished as a symbol of chauvinism and incitement to national hatred. And this decree was carried out on May the 16th. On April the 16th, the Commune ordered a statistical tabulation of factories which had been closed down by the manufacturers and the working out of plans for the carrying on of these factories by workers formerly employed in them, who were to be organized in cooperative societies, and also plans for organizations of these cooperatives in one great union. On the 20th, so when we talk about changing the relations of production, here was, if you like, in germ form, something that the Commune was thinking about. On the 20th, the Commune abolished night work for bakers. You've got to remember the staple diet of French workers at this time was a loaf of bread or 2 loaves of bread a day. And also the workers' registration cards, which since the Second Empire had been run as a monopoly by police nominees, exploiters of the first rank. The using of these registration cards was transferred to the mayors of the 20 arrondissements of Paris. On April the 30th, the Commune ordered the closing of the pawn shops, P-A-W-N, pawn shops, on the ground that they were a private exploitation of labour and were in contradiction with the right of workers to their instruments of labour and to credit. On May the 5th, it ordered the demolition of the Chapel of Atonement, which had built in expiation of the execution of Louis XVI. So you get an idea of the kinds of legislation that the Commune tried to put through in that time, and why it was that Marx and Engels saluted the Commune so enthusiastically, because it showed of what the socialist revolution might try to do. Just a germ, but it was that indication that straight away, the very first things, in the most terrible conditions. I mean, you're talking about a war and a siege under which, the time of the Commune and what we're putting in place. So you've heard about the time of the poem, and it's divided into 13 sections. And in these sections, we hear from 2 narrators, actually. We hear from Richard, who is the main narrator. We only find his name out later. We hear from someone who's never actually named, sadly, his wife, who has also narrates 2 of the sections. And the cycle Paul has described of starting in a rural setting, going to London, meeting with revolutionaries, and then going to Paris. And then it's in fact a sort of love triangle that is set up between Richard, Arthur, a middle-class socialist, and his wife. And in fact, sorry, spoiler alert, the wife and Arthur get killed on the barricade, and Richard comes back to bring up the son that he had with the wife unnamed. And I just thought I'd read you just to finish, because I'm very worried that my signal is poor. I thought I'd read you a couple of parts. So here from Sending to the War, Sending to the War, we get this scene. So it's a rather brilliant scene in which Morris is showing his disgust, if you like, with the chauvinism of war and empire. I once had a conversation with the wonderful and brilliant critic Edward Said, Palestinian brought up in voice of dissent against empire. And at the time, I don't think I knew fully. Hearing me, I'll just read you this bit. Sun and wind in the street, familiar things made clear.
Oh, Michael, you're just cutting out a bit now. You've frozen. Sadly. Okay, that is unfortunate. While I think, well, we get Michael to maybe leave the meeting and come back in and see if that helps with the internet issues, and then he can come back and read what he's reading. So sorry about that, but we do have a couple of questions that we do have Paul still with us. So I think this is one for kind of what everyone really, but Carol asks, what do you think are the main points to note from the poem in terms of ongoing relevance? So I don't know if you have any ideas about that, Paul. And also Lauren has put the comment, I hear people say that the massive march and outpouring against the Iraq war was futile because it didn't stop the war happening. I believe that protest is never futile. So always so much to be learned. So if you have any comments on that, Paul, do you think that that protest is ever futile, or what can we learn from these kind of protests and uprisings that sadly don't always result in a clear victory?
Yeah. Yes. Sorry, I was just checking whether I was muted or not. Look, socialists really...
One, two.
Socialists live with one foot in the past and one foot in the future. The past is about the great struggles that have taken place, the history that creates a working class consciousness that's passed down through generation to generation, that arise out of the struggles that take place. I remember when, and I suppose this applies to history as well. Yes, we've lost nearly all the battles up to now, but one day, learning from that, it will enable us to win a battle. Do you remember when Margaret Thatcher and the rest were down? Was it in Brighton when the IRA put a bomb in their hotel? And Danny Morrison of Sinn Féin said that, yeah, they were lucky that time, but they have to be lucky every time. We only have to be lucky once. And that's what we learned. That's the point, that we don't get demoralized by the defeats of the past. We learn from the defeats of the past, and that we use that to actually move into the future and hopefully build a better world that these people went out and fought for. Sorry, what was the other question?
The other question was kind of about points to note in the poem in terms of relevance.
Well, I sort of covered that in my introduction. I mean, I do think just for the very day that's in it, or the very week that's in it, the issue of the Home Secretary's policing bill against open air, against demonstrations, and the protests against it could be lifted straight out of the center of this poem, where the police attempt to break up the open air demonstrations, which Morris and his friends are engaged in, as is Richard, who is one of the protagonists in the poem and who ends up in jail for. So, I mean, that's absolutely current in terms of lessons for today.
Thanks, Paul. Michael, you seem to be back, and looks like you're here. Yeah.
We're victims of the vagaries of the gigantic megalopolis that we call BT. So it's a kind of little moral for us, really. There, you see, if it was under workers' control, it wouldn't be like that. I'm just going to read maybe just one more bit before. So, Paul, thank you very much for stepping in. It's actually where Morris describes and uses his anger against the justice. He says this is the wife narrating this, I think, at this point. Well, the white-haired fool on the bench was busy, it seems, that day. And so with the words 2 months, he swept the case away. Yet he lectured my man ere he went, but not for the riot, indeed, for which he was sent to prison, but for holding a dangerous creed. What have you got to do to preach such perilous stuff? To take some care of yourself should find you work enough. If you needs must preach or lecture, then hire a chapel or hall. Though indeed, if you take my advice, you'll just preach nothing at all, but stick to your work. You seem clever. Who knows, but you might rise and become a little builder, should you condescend to be wise. For in spite of your silly sedition, the land that we live in is free and opens a pathway to merit for you as well as for me. So we get a nice piece of satire and invective from Morris there, put into the mouth of the wife, the unnamed woman. It gives it indeed, as Paul was saying just there, that I picked up, a kind of modernity to it, because this is precisely the kinds of things that we're hearing now, that, it's certain opinions that are dangerous. So, yes, as I say, I find the poem very inspiring in a variety of ways. And one little bit that I'll add in there is that it's in its own way, it's very experimental, partly born out of this episodic nature that Paul mentioned, the fact that it appeared in separate editions of Commonweal. And so it's not like a continuous narrative. In fact, there's one section where we go backward. Well, no, we go forwards in time, rather oddly, so that we find out the end of the plot sort of early. And then also he changes the way he writes. So at the beginning, it follows one rhyme scheme and then it changes. And of course, some people get a bit kind of sniffy about this sort of thing, but more than 100 years later, I think we can grow up a bit and accept the fact that this is the beginning. These are the beginning signs of modernism, in which we can actually play around with the forms that we use. And if we're really pushing it, we might say, well, this is part of Morris's spirit. I mean, most of the time he wrote in quite conventional ways. And what's slightly different about this is that actually he broke out of some of the constraints of conventional forms. And I won't say it's revolutionary in that respect, of course not, but there's something where you can feel him experimenting with form, just as he was experimenting with ideas towards the end of the poem about how do three people, star-crossed lovers or whatever cliche you might want to use, triangles, how do they cope in a situation in which they're bound by common political thoughts and feelings, if you like. And so again, he's dealing with something that was very pressing, if you like, and again quite experimental. But I better stop just in case my signal goes again. Sorry. Yeah.
It seems fine at the moment, and I would encourage people to
if there's questions and so on, maybe
asking questions. I don't see any questions just yet, but while we're waiting for people to kind of gather their thoughts a bit, I mean, I would like to, I could ask a question to start us off. I mean, I'd like to hear more about Morris's legacy really today, because it seems like, he's mostly known to probably a lot of people outside of the socialist left as someone who designed wallpaper, and you can buy that wallpaper in John Lewis these days. So do you think that some of the kind of radical content of his thought and revolutionary ideas have become a bit lost a bit these days when people talk about William Morris?
Yes, in a way. I'll answer that. Paul might like to answer it as well, if you can still hear me. Yeah, I mean, the thing is, right, Morris had a worldview of what it was that he thought he was doing. So he was a socialist, he was a Marxist, he was a communist, and devoted himself to activism. But part of his whole theory was that capitalism had taken away the humanity of human beings, of man, he would have expressed it quite often. And so he felt that all those things to do with beauty, creativity, some of these are words that we're using, but certainly beauty is a word he used, but creativity have been snatched away from the working class. I mean, one way in which that's sometimes viewed is that capitalism not only takes away the fruits of people's labor, but it also takes away something of their humanity. Now, perhaps sometimes in Victorian times that was overstated, but Morris felt that every human being was entitled to have and to make beautiful things. And so he devoted his life to doing that. And what's slightly difficult for us now in approaching Morris is sometimes the fact that some of his inspiration for this was drawing on medieval life and even sometimes pre-medieval life in the kind of sagas of the epic eras, the warrior cultures and so on. So his inspiration for that was perhaps an idealized version of what medieval life was like and the kinds of mutuality that went on in that time. But he did draw an inspiration for that. And then when it came to his own creativity, you know, we can salute that, even if though it's been recuperated. And, you know, you can go into posh shops and buy his textiles, go to Liberty's just off Oxford Street sort of thing. But the point is, he was trying to integrate the beauty that he saw around in the nature that he thought that was defiled. So when you look at a William Morris design, if you can see that, he was trying to make that available for everybody. So he was, as it were, looking at nature and finding a way of making it so that it could be on people's walls, people's wallpapers, on people's cushion covers, and in an ideal world be affordable for everybody. And again, sorry to labour the point, but also he believed that books themselves could be made beautiful. He made an edition, for example, of Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, which is an incredible art object, which nowadays we might see as slightly defeating the purpose, because if you make a very beautiful art object that becomes very valuable, you're not socialising it. But you can see the impulse. The impulse was that every human being has the right not to be degraded in the way that capitalism does, but also more than that, have the right to take part in cultural activity and also to have beautiful things around them instead of to be poisoned by what the society was producing. So that was the impulse. But you're right in a way that, of course, a lot of it has been recuperated, and the Morris that we know through the politics gets left at the door, and it's seen as somehow or other slightly sullying the beauty of William Morris, you know. And we know this is a pattern. It's one of the patterns of middle-class intellectual culture, that it tries to cut off the politics. Paul knows this better than all of us. It's what they do with Shelley, and to kind of denude him of even of the politics of poems about like a lark, which is flying in the air and it's free. And to denude that of the politics, they do it to Wordsworth, and miss out the fact that when he wandered around looking at daffodils, he was looking at wild daffodils because they were free. So they denude these people of their politics. And so, yes, it's hard to save Morris, but that's part of our job. You know, it's part of any person engaged in intellectual life and has the kind of commitments that we're talking about here. And part of your job is to do the opposite of what is the word is recuperation. Do the opposite of it. We'll save them for the movement.
Thanks.
Just add a word or two. I think Morris is important in our tradition, because what he adds is this concept of a vision of what a different world could look like, you know, where beauty is allied to use, and, you know, where that we're not talking about consumerism for consumerism's sake, that his emphasis on cooperation. And he adds, as I said, something just to the hard economics of the Marxist tradition. And I think that's something that's worth reclaiming. I've always felt in the last 10 or 20 years we're sort of losing that tradition of the way the socialist movement and the radical movement has traditionally used poetry and song and literature to explain its position. I mean, I can't remember where it is, but somewhere, and I think I'm not even sure if it's Morris, but I thought it was a wonderful explanation just in a simple sentence of the failure of the Commune in Paris, where it's described as the village weaver against the power loom. And that was really what Morris is trying to get over. The relations between, the emerging working class in the middle of the 1800s and industrial capitalism at the time. And personally, I like it, but many people actually really don't like the way Morris looks back to what they call an idealist past, of the medieval period, of where peasants are prosperous in their little village, weaving and crafting away, and guilds protect workers from exploitation. Now, there is an element of truth in that, but it's also, I suspect, a very idealized view of the Middle Ages, and even the pre-Middle Ages. But Morris is such a wonderful writer. I think it's really important for us to bring him into our tradition, to widen the tradition, and let's not be afraid of contradiction and complexity within the socialist tradition. I mean, contradiction and complexity is how we arrive at our understanding of a very complex world out there. And Morris is part of that, and that's why I'm so glad that this book is coming out.
Great. I've got a few more questions in now from people watching. And I think they are related to each other. But Mark asks, the recent In Our Time programme about Morris on Radio 4 put great emphasis on his medievalism. It's one of the purposes of the publication of this book to remind people that Morris was a revolutionary who looked to a socialist future. Peter has asked how...
Hang on, Camilla, I better just we'll take one by one.
All right.
Yeah,
I think that's Mike's, as it was his programme.
Not In Our Time. No, that's not mine.
Oh, that's not yours, sorry.
No, In Our Time is Melvin Brank here.
I've heard,
right.
Yes, of course.
Yes, don't worry. So as a book, it wasn't meant to be immediately a reply to In Our Time. It came about actually partly because Roger and I did another book that Red Words have done, Poems of Resistance, which we collected together Morris's some of shorter poems, his Chants of Labour, and some of the others, one or two others. And so, yes, we've tried to make, both with that and with Pilgrims of Hope, to put Morris's poetry, and particularly his more socialist, if you like, more directly socialist poetry in front of people. So it is available with Roger's wonderful book design and editing. And also, I mean, Morris's literature in general, if you go to it, it is well worth a look. Someone has asked a question about the kind of eco-socialism that people have seen in Morris's work. I'll come back to that in a moment. But yes, fundamentally, if you put works of the past in front of people and you put them in a certain context, you remind them, you draw attention to the fact that what their content is. And part of it, as Paul is saying, we deal with contradictions and so on. So Shakespeare, for example, is put on a pedestal. He's put on a pedestal to a point in which he's made safe and cozy. But in actual fact, Shakespeare often expressed many of the struggles and contradictions in Elizabethan society. If you look at Twelfth Night, King Lear, or Coriolanus, these are very, very political plays in which Shakespeare has to represent, the struggles going on of those times. When you listen carefully to what King Lear is saying, it's in its own way in that play. He's lambasting the crimes of the old ruling class. He says, I've done wrong. We must shake the superflux. I must share out the wealth that my lot have had up until now. And he discovers this when he's sharing the conditions of the poor with somebody who's at the time known as Poor Tom. So, I wrote another book for Red Words called Shakespeare in Our Time, of his times for our time, for the same reason. So we struggle over literature. And that's an important point, that the debates that we have about these writers and cultural figures, and indeed to celebrate them, is part of our job. At least it's always been part of my job. Keith Flett, I see, has got a question about Morris had a vision of socialism that was buried by Labourism and Stalinism. Well, indeed. I mean, nice to see you there, Fletty. I mean, there is always the problem that when socialists, real socialists and revolutionists appear within the British tradition, maybe so in other countries as well, but let's stick with the British one for the moment, is they do get very quickly buried. I mean, only the other day I saw that one of the MPs is regretting the fact that he had spoken out against capitalism, because in the present context, that's what they do. And we know that, and we only have to go to Ed Miliband's dad's book, Ralph Miliband's book, to realise that this is a never-ending cycle, that we have these hopes in the Labour Party that there will be some socialist content in their thoughts and actions, but they get buried indeed. The issue as to whether it got buried by Stalinism is, of course, a much bigger question. Over to Paul. Maybe Paul might like to answer some of the other questions.
Yeah, I'd like to come in on that because I think it's a very important discussion on the relationship between literature and politics. And that is one that had got derailed with the rise of Stalinism in the 30s and 40s, and their prescription, the socialist realist prescription, the laying down the rules of what working class literature could be and what style, etc., that it should be written in. And even though, well, people do say that James Joyce was a sort of a crypto-socialist somewhere within him, I thought he wrote a wonderful piece where he described the great literature of the past was like a well, and we can go to the well and draw up this classic literature and of the past, and we can use it to inspire people to take action in the present. Now, I think that's a wonderful description of what these great writers of the past have, the legacy that they've left us. It's a well we can go to whenever we need to stand up on a platform and speak or inspire people or whatever. That's what it had. That's what the past has. I mean, Shelley, in his pamphlet called "In Defense of Poetry," said that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. And Shelley's concept of the role and function of poetry has certainly changed over time. There's no doubt about it. But writing in the same tradition, the Irish poet Seamus Heaney said, you know, in one sense, the effect of poetry is nil. He said, no lyric ever stopped the tank. But in another sense, and I think this is the important part of it, in another sense, it is unlimited. It is like the writing in the sand, in the face of which accusers and accused are left speechless and renewed. And that's, I think, why we have to retain that connection between literature and politics that sort of was severed during the Stalinist period. And I know during the 60s and 70s that did happen. Out of the great events of 1966, there was an effusion of literature and poetry, and all our publications carried, the writers and poets and songsters, and music was all part of it. And I think that's something that we have to do in the future as well.
Yeah, I can see there a question from Sarah Cox about Bauhaus, or a comment really, and yes, that's a great contribution indeed. If people can't see that, I'll read that out. Similar to Morris's ideas about beauty in the home and in everyday life are the ideas of some of the Bauhaus designers and architects like Lubetkin, who designed wonderful council homes and says that ordinary people were entitled to the best. Yeah, I mean, if you look at Bauhaus, in some respects, some of it is indeed very inspiring because they tried to work out, I mean, this was functionalism taken to its logical point, where they said that if you are so totally devoted to function in design, you will end up with a new kind of beauty. And indeed, when you look at things like the kettles or the knives and forks, or indeed the designs of the buildings, you know, this was a form of minimalism without the kind of very anti-Morris in its own way, anti-William Morris in terms of what he was trying to do, rather than decorate the surface. You said the surface had to perform a function. And again, we can be inspired by both. We don't necessarily have to be absolutist as either Morris or Bauhaus. But indeed, the idea, but some of the radicals in Bauhaus said this was for everybody. And I'll give you a little terrible irony of history. One estate that was inspired by Bauhaus, an estate was built on the outskirts of Paris, which some of you will know was called Drancy. And this estate got then perverted to being a transit camp for the Nazis during the occupation of France. And it was used, abused and misused to, in fact, keep prisoners, communists and Jews largely, who were then deported. So, you know, these things can be perverted in all sorts of ways. It was, quotes, very convenient as a big prison to stick people in, just as it had been envisaged as a kind of, and this was one of the phrases that came out of Bauhaus, a machine for living, because they wanted to give the idea that industry could be used to create these functionalist, but at the same time beautiful places. So it does, in a way, exactly as Sarah Cox points out, overlap with Morris, with the sense that this stuff that humans can create should be available for everybody. And if we can find ways to do that, we can see visions of it even in the present. So even though Bauhaus comes out of Germany of the 20s and 30s, you know, it's not a socialist utopia, far from it. That we can see these visions of the future in the present, and that's important. Yeah. Yeah, in fact, that's Peter Tyak's point. There we are. I could have read that. Maybe he wanted to take the best from the past to build a better future. Yes, so I've stolen your idea there, Peter. Apologies. Yes. Somebody was making the point about eco-socialism. Yes, I have read it before, and it did send me back to Morris, that some people have pointed out that some of the medievalist poetry that he wrote is in actual fact so much a celebration of what is loosely called nature. Somebody like Raymond Williams, of course, argues with that. But anyway, what is loosely called nature does take us into a form of eco-socialism. It does take us to a form where that whatever kind of socialism that is made, it has to be in symbiosis, in harmony with whatever is nature. I mean, to take Raymond Williams, though, as a kind of slightly precautionary point, what we call nature, countryside, the pastoralist nature, is of itself a site for class war. So Raymond Williams points this out very well, that when we look at a landscape, that landscape was created out of the exploitation of labor. And it goes on, no matter how much we rush into the woods and go, oh, look, I'm free, I'm free. Those woods were planted by somebody, they're pollarded by somebody, by working people who are being employed more often than not. And that one of the worst aspects of pastoralism is that it conceals the fact that the pastoralist landscape we're looking at was created out of labor and out of exploited labor. So we have to be quite careful about using nature as the sort of source for socialism. I mean, that's where we might argue with Morris from a distance.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It relates to my interest in nature. Paul, did you have anything to add to that? I think people are also asking about how the poem relates to News from Nowhere, Morris's one of his other works.
How it relates to News from Nowhere. There are similarities, but there are also differences. If you look at his two great prose works, News from Nowhere and The Dream of John Ball, what they are really is both of them are about dreams, where the narrator, if you like, in a dream sequence goes back to the past to see and learn the lessons of the past as to what about a future socialist society may look like. And I think this is what's important about the Pilgrims of Hope. Yes, there are elements of him looking back to a medieval period, but essentially he's only looking back for 14 or 15 years to the Paris Commune. He understands the importance of the link in the chain of history that the Paris Commune has thrown up or put together, and that is, you know, a much more current idea for what the Socialist League and socialists who came after him would take from it, rather than just the medievalism, as I said, what De Valera once described as athletic youths and comely maidens dancing at the crossroads, as his vision of what an independent Ireland might look like. And there's always that problem within, I think, Morris's work, that he, romanticizes the past. And it's a past, really, that even in a society that's facing global catastrophe, and whatever way we rearrange the world going into the future to take account of that medieval world can never be recreated in the future. Just the conditions that it grew up in is actually gone. But that's not to say that there aren't these currents. I mean, John Molyneux talked about the eco-socialism that's contained in some of Morris's work. Yes, we can look to Morris to try and work through what our understanding of eco-socialism, but with all the limitations that Mike just talked about and I've just mentioned.
Thanks, Paul. Just got more of a comment from Peter Tyack just come in.
And I've always felt a kind of discomfort in the countryside for the reason that Michael's outlined, but I've also felt liberation from the city at the same time. Yeah, I'll read that again. I've always felt, says Peter Tyack, a kind of discomfort in the countryside for the reasons that Michael has outlined, but I also felt liberated from the city at the very same time. Yes, I mean, have a look. Raymond Williams, The Country and the City. I think it's a very brilliant book because it opens the conversation about how we envisage the city and how we envisage the countryside as being these very different places. But it's an illusion. If we say that the material base of society is the way we organize ourselves around production, then agribusiness, which is nature, is not really that different from what is going on in the city. What is different is the fact that obviously people in the countryside are by and large not living cheek by jowl, but in fact, when you look in villages and you look at the history of, say, 19th century dwellings in the countryside, you find that, yes, indeed, they were living cheek by jowl. Yes, indeed, they were living in terrible conditions, easily as bad as the slums of East London, where people used to go and describe they were going into Babylon in order to see the living conditions where people like my great-grandparents lived in the East End of London. They used to describe that as a journey into Babylon. You even find the writer Emile Zola, when he comes to London, he's taken on a trip to Whitechapel in order to see the poverty-stricken conditions my great-grandparents were living in. So it was a pattern that you went to the cities to kind of see this terrible degradation. Meanwhile, you went into the countryside and breathed fresh air and saw somehow or other some kind of harmony. But what I'm saying is it's an illusion that, in fact, is, of course, tragically, it's how the Romantic poets are themselves misinterpreted. What they took from nature, as they saw it, was that it was free. And so that was what they enjoyed about it. They also used the word nature and natural in that kind of a way. And Morris is like a kind of late romantic in some senses, because you can see even in the fact that he's using the image of the wind as if somehow or other that is of itself free of class, but that's fine. Exactly as Paul says, we can be inspired by these images, but let's not delude ourselves into thinking that this sounds perverse, that nature is natural. The nature we look at isn't natural. It's entirely human-made that we're looking at, and it's made through, the exploitation of labor. I once watched a program about slavery and about the experience of African Americans, and the whole landscape of Mississippi, was created out of slave labor because of the draining and the building of the levees and the draining and the channeling of the Mississippi and so on. It's like a massive industrialized landscape that is obscure from us because it looks free, looks like there's the river flowing of its own, but these things aren't true. So, and the city, on the other hand, is places, of course, where many people come together, and where many ideas are produced, and where people live in communities of one sort or another, and where again we can find hope. I mean, again, in Pilgrims of Hope, the point is in the resistance that Richard, when he is resisting, that we see, and he's put into prison, we can be inspired by that in the same way as we can by Oscar Wilde's wonderful, incredible poem, The Ballad of Reading Gaol. I mean, if you want an inspiring poem out of injustice, if you like, or indeed we can go to Kafka. I mean, people have mentioned, the weight of Stalinism on literature. The Stalinists thought Kafka was a bad guy because there was no hope, but we can be inspired by his incremental analysis of the corruption of bureaucracy, in the hands of the state. We can be inspired by that and be enraged with Kafka at this kind of torture of the human soul and be inspired by it. So all these things are possible with literature. Yes, thank you, Peter Tyack.
Yeah, I think it's about time to sort of sum up. But I'm going to ask each of our speakers whether they have any final things to add before we say goodnight. Paul, first, did you have any last things to say?
Yeah, well, look, I enjoyed that and all the questions and the discussion. Usually these things throw up far more than the people who've introduced the talk actually does. And as I said, I think the most important thing I have to say is to encourage people to read this book and to go to some of Morris's other work. As I said, a personal favourite of mine is The Dream of John Ball. I think it's a wonderful piece of work and very inspiring piece of work. But one thing we're talking, I suppose we've been running through this is that, well, certainly from I think from both of us, I'm sure from both of us, is the need for us as socialists, as radicals, as activists to sort of reclaim literature and art for our side, not in any crude Stalinist way whatsoever. And this really struck home to me yesterday when I saw a piece from somebody, an observer in Myanmar, and they were reporting that 2 poets had been killed by the regime. And the line that she said was, "They have come for the poets." And when the regime comes for the poets, as they did in Chile in 1973, then you know what the power of poetry is in the way that Seamus Heaney described it. It draws a line in the sand. And to me, it's no accident that some of the best poetry in the English language in the 1970s came out of the struggle in Northern Ireland, people like Heaney, Muldoon, and all the rest of them. Because when great struggles take place, people reach for words in a way to explain their predicament that goes beyond just the ordinary conversation. And I think that's the power of poetry. It gives expression that people can immediately understand, lines and rhythms that they can remember and repeat to other people. And that's why I enjoy Morris so much. Yes, he's very idealistic and all the rest of it, but he's a very powerful writer and someone who I enjoy reading very much.
Thanks, Paul. Yes, indeed. While I remember, because I've got a message from Dave here, I've got to do a big hello to my friends or his friends in Hamburg. I've got to mention Colm and Luca. So hi there. If you're German, I'll say Guten Tag or Guten Abend, I guess. And they're my friends. So they're meinen Freundin, I think I can say, meinen Freundin. I'm struggling with my O-level German here. So anyway, Guten Abend, I'll say to you, and hello. Okay.
Happy birthday, Nina. You're big on TikTok, birthday? Apparently, in Hamburg.
Oh, it's Nina. So Geburtstag, good Geburtstag, Nina. So happy birthday. So I've just finished with a little mention of the book. Thanks largely to Roger Huddle, that this is a book that is the Pilgrims of Hope, but indeed set in various contexts. And we hope that will be enriching for people reading it. So as I said at the beginning, you get an essay, quite a theoretical essay from Nicholas Salmon, but you also get Morris and Engels and a timeline, because one of the tricks that is played on literature is to take it out of its historical context and suggest that what you're reading or what you're looking at in the theatre, say, is for all time. So it's made safe by universalizing it. So they might say that, you know, Romeo and Juliet is about hopeless love or something. And so you lose the social content of it. It's one of the tricks played by the way we quite often study literature at school. In actual fact, you can take a play like Romeo and Juliet and actually see that totally implicated in it are the struggles of two large families, two families alike in dignity, and that what they're arguing about is whether you own your offspring. And there is an argument about that in the famous scene, you know, when Juliet's father starts shouting at her, that he's saying, well, I'll get rid of you, my property, out baggage. He says, you know, he uses the word baggage. So in one of the tricks of treating literature is to take it away from its social context. Now, with Pilgrims of Hope, it's a very political poem, so it's less easy to do it. But at the same time, you know, people can do it, even with a play. Again, sorry, I'm going to Shakespeare, Twelfth Night. You can denude it of the fact that it's a play that is in part about colonization. You know, there are two slaves on the island, and then some people come and they revolt against the slave owner. You know, people hardly ever see, sorry, The Tempest, I should have said, not Twelfth Night, both begin with T. The Tempest, that people take that away from the play and say that it's about, you know, a magic island, which it is. So, you know, there's ways in which that is. So one of the great things about this little book, if I might plug it once more, is that it sets the thing in a context. This comes about because of Morris's politics. It comes about because it happened after the Commune. And Paul's drawn attention to the fact of the kind of poetry that isn't necessarily even immediately about the troubles, so-called, in Northern Ireland, but are born of the troubling times. And so indeed, we can be inspired by a wonderful poet like Shamsini, Michael Longley as well from that time, who could express the disturbance in our minds because the mind is in its times. And indeed, that becomes very clear from the way Morris writes in this book. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks to both our speakers, Paul O'Brien and Michael Rosen. I think it's been a fascinating discussion. Started with the Paris Commune, and we've talked about art, we've talked about policing, the state, and about ecology as well, of course. And the video of this will be available. It will stay up on the Facebook, and I believe it's also on YouTube as well, and all the rest. So you can share it with people who haven't been watching it live. You can also buy the book, of course. The book is called Pilgrims of Hope, William Morris and the Paris Commune, and it includes the poem and an introduction by Michael Rosen, and Morris's Why We Celebrate, and a piece by Engels as well, and the other essays that people have talked about. It is published by Redwoods, so thank you to Roger Huddle for all the work he does publishing those books. And it's available at Bookmarks, the Socialist Bookshop, and you can buy it online, and at some point in the near future, possibly even in the shop in central London. The next Bookmarks event will be on the 9th of April, and we have Kathy Porter, the author, talking about Alexandra Kollontai, Writings from the Struggle, which she has edited and translated. And so do join us for that on the 9th of April. Oh, yes, also you can buy many of Michael Rosen's books, including Many Different Kinds of Love, Story of Life, Death, and the NHS. That's just being advertised there. Great, so thanks again for the speakers, and stay safe, and we'll see you at the next Bookmarks event.